you. Pleased to welcome my first guest this morning, Professor Christopher Green. He teaches in the Ole Miss Law School and regular guest here on SuperTalk. Christopher, good morning. Thanks so much for jumping in.
Good morning. This is an interesting spring with the Supreme Court.
It really is, and they have a docket that is full, and I'm assuming that they are not going to get to much that is on that docket. Yesterday, though, the Supreme Court began hearing arguments in this charter school case. If you don't mind, why don't you start out with a quick summary of exactly what it is that they are looking at right now?
Sure. So there's been several cases in the last few years where they have the Supreme Court has really taken a look at. So there's a long history of having state constitutional limits on funding to religious entities of any kind. And there's always been a complaint that this is discrimination against religious citizens. If you're a citizen of a different creed, you ought to have the same civil rights. That's the idea. And because of that, there's just been this long-standing tension. So basically, Oklahoma has a charter school system. So they have a system where you can set up private folks can come together and say, hey, we want to have a special kind of school with a different sort of curriculum. And this will be in the system of the public schools. There's basically one of the big questions in the case is this literally a public school, or is this a private school getting participation in a public system? But basically, this is not a private school as such. They just kind of teach whatever, subject to a voucher program. This has a bunch of curricular requirements. And basically what the argument against including religious schools is, if we were looking really carefully at your curricular requirements, whether you're teaching math, whether you're teaching certain kinds of literature, whether you're teaching certain kinds of history and all that, and at the same time, we had to worry about doing that in a religious way, there would be too much entanglement. We just want, as a state, the state of Oklahoma, just to get out of this business. Would that count as neutrality? Getting out of the business of having any involvement with religiously focused charter schools for the sake of getting rid of this entanglement. And it looks like the Supreme Court is pretty likely to say, no, that's not a sufficient reason. Justice Barrett is out, so the conservatives would have to roll all five of theirs, including Justice Kavanaugh and Chief Justice Roberts. But it certainly looks like they will. Justice Kavanaugh went on at length about the problems with this kind of approach, and Chief Justice Roberts certainly seemed sympathetic to this claim as well.
So there are multiple legal questions, as you describe it, as I see it, before the Supreme Court. One of them is about religious freedom. One of them is about the separation of church and state. One of them is about the definition of public versus private. There's a question about public funds going to fund religious private schools. But we do have to remember, and I think you pointed this out, well, two things that you pointed out, I don't want those to get glossed over. Number one, Amy Coney Barrett is sitting this out. So there are 8 justices on this panel, not 9. She is close friends with one of the parties that is involved in this charter school conversation. And then the other thing that I think you pointed out that we need to remember is that these charter schools in Oklahoma are held to the same testing standards or educational standards that the rest of the public school system is. It is not a separate private entity that doesn't have to do state testing and meet certain standards.
That's right. So, all 3 of the more liberal justices seem pretty skeptical. They have all, been pretty skeptical in the earlier cases. Justice Jackson, some people thought, well, maybe she'll be, disagree on some issues, not on this one. So they have had cases. So the earlier cases have said very specifically, states are not required to set up a voucher system, not required to set up a system other than the public schools.
Right.
But once they do, they have to be neutral in the ways in which people are participating. So a lot of the discussion was exactly what did we mean in these earlier cases where we said the state is not required to set up any kind of voucher system or system of parental choice or anything like that. Does that apply to this? So the big question that the big question that's being asked here, and you correct me if I'm wrong on this, is it okay for this Oklahoma charter school that has religious curriculum to go along with the rest of its educational curriculum? Is it okay for this school to receive public money? Is that the ultimate question? That's the basic question. So if it were just a straight up, we're subsidizing X and we don't want to subsidize Y because it's religious. So the first case was about chopped up tires for a playground. It's like if you're giving chopped up tires to the secular private schools, you got to give chopped up tires to the religious schools too. And then there were questions about whether if you had a state constitutional requirement, whether that was an excuse, whether if you had a voucher program that applied to some, whether that's going to apply. So the basic question is a state compelled sometimes to give money to a religious entity for religious stuff, so paying for a religious curriculum, if you're paying for a secular curriculum, that's already been established. The only question is the apparatus of the charter school system with all these curricular requirements, is the existence of that apparatus and the entanglement of theology in how you teach different things, is that enough of a reason to discriminate against religious entities? So, for instance, you've got this history requirement that you teach certain aspects of the founding. Well, I mean, somebody could sit down and say, let's really dig into the theology of the Declaration of Independence and look at Romans 13 or something and say, let's have a theological debate about whether the Declaration of Independence was a violation of Romans 13. And you might have a theology class where you present, the ideas of the church that runs the school on that issue. Well, that's not something you would never do in the public schools. Evaluating that whether you're teaching about the Declaration of Independence properly, there would be issues about whether that job would be too complicated if you got to disentangle the theology. But it does seem like the Supreme Court's going to say, you can't discriminate on that basis. That justification is not enough of a justification. This is essentially one way to think of it. Is this a civil right about how the government treats citizens? Or is this a kind of political question about how the government organizes itself? Is this an internal question about who's staffing different things? Because the government doesn't have to, accept all comers with respect to letting people act on behalf of the state, but they do have to treat all citizens equally to the extent that it's a question of the government treating citizens a certain way. This charter school system really does seem to the court like it's a system that's set up in order to treat all citizens of all creeds equally. And once you see it that way, you're gonna require the state to play ball with religious groups as well.
So to me, that opens the door. This is, I think, a Christian charter school or a charter school with Christian teachings in Oklahoma. If the Supreme Court says, yes, it's okay for there to be Bible curriculum that goes along with history, math, reading, writing, arithmetic, to boil it down, what is to stop there from being a charter school that is teaching Islam or is teaching, I'll use an extreme example and say Satanism or whatever else? I mean, that would be really, really concerning for a lot of people. But if the Supreme Court says it's okay for Christian teaching, doesn't that open the door for it to be okay for, Presbyterian or Methodist or Islam or whatever else?
Yeah. So some of the opposition to this idea was, oh my goodness, we're going to have madrasas and we're going to have people. I mean, some of the fears are, oh my goodness, we're going to have people training up suicide bombers here in Oklahoma. And I mean, Oklahoma has dealt with terrorism in the past. Certainly you can so, questions about like encouragement of crime or something like that, you can restrict that in any event. So to the extent that the school is like literally complicit in crime or encouraging violence, you can deal with that on that level. But it would have to be some sort of generally applicable criterion about public safety, about certain kinds of views. There has always been room to restrict that. Satanism, if it literally is encouraging violence, would be a different question.
Hold that thought if you don't mind. I'm going to keep you through the break. Couple more questions for you, visiting with law professor Christopher Green. Teaches at the University of Mississippi Law School. We're back. Mornings with Richard Cross, SuperTalk, Mississippi. Professor Christopher Green is my guest. Teaches in the law school at Ole Miss. Regular contributor here on SuperTalk, Mississippi. I want to try to get to two questions with you here. I don't know if we'll have time for two. Bringing this topic of the Supreme Court and religious charter schools or charter schools receiving public funding if they are teaching religious curriculum in part, trying to bring that back to the state of Mississippi. It is my prediction, and I'm not going out on a limb, it's a lot of people's prediction, that the biggest issue that the legislature in Mississippi is going to face next year and try to tackle next year is the school choice conversation here in the state of Mississippi.
Oh, yeah, again.
Again. What might this mean if Mississippi were to ultimately go with universal school choice, in which public funding would then follow students if it was universal choice and perhaps go to private schools as well? What would this mean for private Christian or Catholic or Scientology, whatever schools? Would that mean that they are open to funding from the state as part of a universal school choice conversation?
They certainly could be. And our state is a little different from every other. We have a lot of people in our state, a lot of people in the kind of homeschooling, private education world that really want to have as little as possible to do with any governmental funding. And a lot of those folks, there's probably more in Mississippi than any other state, which is, I think, the reason why, even though every state around us has a universal school choice program, we don't have one. It's folks, and I'm close friends with a lot of these folks, people who just don't want to have any kind of contact with the state because they're worried that will come with strings. But it's up to the state what kind of strings to put on it. Scientology, for instance, they have a long running set of questions really with the IRS, because they have just kind of some really idiosyncratic views about what counts as a donation and things like that. So certainly places that have, really unusual views about, saying they're not subject to certain kinds of laws, those could be regulated even if they don't get any public money. So they could just say, look, you're not allowed to encourage people to commit crimes. You can't have a school of the mafia or something. So I am inclined to think that some of those fears are overblown. But
I'm sorry, I'm laughing. I was thinking, okay, who's going to be the first to roll out the Gotti school?
Yeah.
Sorry, carry on.
Yeah. So when the Supreme Court writes this opinion, so everybody's kind of thinking they'll probably say Oklahoma is required to do to allow religious folks in the building. There's likely to be, and it really depends on what Kavanaugh and Roberts think they need, or just what kind of pressure they're under from arguments from the dissents. There's probably going to be a paragraph saying, of course, states are allowed to have requirements about X, Y, and Z. A lot of the conversation in the oral argument yesterday was, are the states allowed to have requirements on X, Y, and Z? And then if the Mississippi legislature decided to have a requirement like that, And if they decided to fund a universal voucher program, well, then a lot of private schools, or a lot of people who are homeschooling now think, hey, maybe we should get 5-10 families together and start us one of these schools. We would have to be subject to these curricular requirements. So, there's folks that kind of the much more kind of radical libertarian sorts say they don't want Mississippi parents to be placed under that kind of pressure. The pressure they're under now is just the raw financial pressure of having to pay property taxes for the school system, but not getting any benefit. The worry is, even if you do get the benefit, it may come with these strings. And it totally depends on what the legislature wants and what the U.S. Supreme Court is willing to kind of give their blessing to. But even if they give their blessing to it, the legislature, you can still argue with the legislature, like you could put in structural things to try to guarantee that there's going to be genuine freedom for religious citizens in these things. But it's it's a delicate political dance, and you sometimes, especially at the end of the session, coming up this time of the year when you're like, who's going to get what kinds of money? We find it out like all within like 20 minutes. You're like, what did the governor sign? What did the governor not sign? What committees are going to? Because
district project funding seems to be the biggest thing that is still hanging in there in terms of the budget debate in the legislature with the special session upcoming. Christopher, unfortunately, we are out of time. I wish we had more because there are a couple of other directions I would like to go. Always appreciate your time, appreciate your insight. This Supreme Court decision is going to be interesting to watch. Thanks so much.
Great talking to you. Take care.
You as well. Professor Christopher Green teaches in the Ole Miss Law School and a Supreme Court scholar. We're going to start the 8 o'clock hour with a conversation with Tawana O'Rear. She's Chief of Operations at Sanctuary Hospice. They have a radiothon going today. We'll talk a little bit more about the mission that is happening there. Mornings with Richard Cross, SuperTalk Mississippi. The news is next, then we're back for the 8 o'clock hour.